As dawn broke over the Austrian countryside on August 8, 1938, the tranquility of the Danube Valley was shattered by the sound of pickaxes and shovels. The Nazi regime had begun construction on what would become one of the most brutal concentration camp complexes of World War II, Mauthausen-Gusen. Nestled in the picturesque hills of Upper Austria, this sprawling network of camps would soon become synonymous with unimaginable horror and suffering. The location was chosen for its proximity to the town of Linz, Hitler's childhood home, and a city he envisioned as a future cultural capital of the Third Reich. The irony of creating a place of death so close to the Führer's birthplace was not lost on some of the camp's early prisoners. The Mauthausen-Gusen complex was not merely a single camp, but a labyrinthine system of interconnected sites designed to exploit slave labor and eradicate those deemed undesirable by the Third Reich. At its core stood the main camp, Mauthausen, classified as a Category 3 camp, the harshest designation in the Nazi concentration camp system. Surrounding it were dozens of subcamps, with Gusen being the largest and most infamous among them. The classification system, devised by Theodor Eicke, the inspector of concentration camps, designated Mauthausen as Grade 3, Stufe 3, reserved for incorrigible political enemies of the Reich with little chance of rehabilitation. This grim designation was reflected in the camp's motto, carved into the granite entrance: Es gibt nur einen Weg zur Freiheit. 10 Meilensteine heißen Gehorsam, Fleiß, Ehrlichkeit, Ordnung, Sauberkeit, Nüchternheit, Wahrhaftigkeit, Opfersinn und Liebe zum Vaterland. There is only one path to freedom. Its milestones are obedience, diligence, honesty, order, cleanliness, sobriety, truthfulness, self-sacrifice, and love of the fatherland. SS Oberführer Franz Zierreis, the camp commandant from 1939 until its liberation, oversaw the expansion of this hellish domain. Under his ruthless leadership, the complex grew to encompass over 50 subcamps spread across Austria and southern Germany. Each site served a specific purpose in the Nazi war machine, from manufacturing aircraft parts to excavating tunnels for underground factories. Zierreis, known for his sadistic nature, often personally participated in the torture and execution of prisoners. One particularly horrifying incident occurred on April 20, 1942, Hitler's birthday, when Zierreis ordered 50 Soviet prisoners to be executed as a gift to the Führer. This event became known among prisoners as the Führer's birthday party. The quarries of Mauthausen and Gusen became the epicenter of suffering within the complex. Known as the Wiener Graben, Vienna Trench, and Kastenhof quarries respectively, these sites were where the concept of extermination through labor was brutally realized. Prisoners, barely clad in threadbare uniforms, were forced to carry massive granite blocks up the infamous Stairs of Death, 186 crude steps carved into the quarry face. The granite extracted from these quarries was used in the construction of many Nazi monuments and buildings, including the grandstand at the Nuremberg rally grounds. The cruel irony of slaves building monuments to their oppressors was not lost on the prisoners, as noted by survivor Iakovos Kambanielis in his memoir Mauthausen. "We were building the Reich that was destroying us, stone by stone." One survivor, Simon Wiesenthal, later recalled the horror. If someone fell over because of exhaustion, the SS wouldn't hesitate to push the whole line over the edge into the quarry void. The sight of broken bodies at the bottom of the quarry became a daily occurrence, with an estimated 3,000 prisoners meeting their end in this manner at Mauthausen alone. Wiesenthal, who would later become a famous Nazi hunter, spent time in both Mauthausen and Gusen. He once said, "For me, hope is what enables us to keep going, even when the odds are enormous. Hope is what gives us strength to persevere." The brutality extended beyond the quarries. In Gusen, the notorious Russenlager, Russian camp, saw the deaths of thousands of Soviet prisoners of war. Subjected to starvation, disease, and barbaric medical experiments, these men were worked to death in underground tunnels, constructing secret aircraft factories for the Messerschmitt Company. Dr. Aribert Heim, known as Dr. Death, conducted horrific experiments on prisoners in Gusen, including injecting various substances directly into their hearts and performing operations without anesthesia. One of his victims, Karol Karsak, a Czech prisoner who miraculously survived, later testified, "I saw him kill a prisoner with an injection to the heart. He timed the man's death with a stopwatch." Yet, even in the depths of this man-made hell, the human spirit refused to be extinguished. Acts of resistance, both large and small, occurred throughout the camp's existence. On February 2, 1945, a group of Soviet officers, led by Lieutenant Alexander Isupov, orchestrated a daring escape from Block 20, known as the Death Block. Though many were recaptured and executed, the event became known as the Mulviertler Hasenjagd, Mulviertel rabbit hunt, and stands as a testament to the indomitable will to survive. Of the 500 prisoners who attempted the escape, only 11 survived to see the end of the war. One of the survivors, Mikhail Rybczynski, later recalled, "We knew we were going to die anyway. We decided it was better to die fighting than to die on our knees." Another form of resistance came through clandestine documentation. Spanish Republican prisoner Francisco Boy, working in the camp's photo lab, managed to smuggle out hundreds of negatives documenting Nazi atrocities. These photographs would later play a crucial role in the Nuremberg trials, providing irrefutable evidence of the crimes committed at Mauthausen-Gusen. Boyd's bravery was matched by that of Anna Pointner, an Austrian civilian who hid the negatives in her garden until the camp's liberation. Years later, Beuys would testify at Nuremberg, saying, "I thought that if I survived, these photos would be the only proof of what happened there." As the Allied forces closed in during the spring of 1945, the camp administration frantically attempted to destroy evidence of their crimes. Gas chambers were dismantled, documents burned, and mass graves hastily concealed. On May 3, 1945, with American troops just miles away, the SS abandoned the camp, leaving behind a sea of emaciated prisoners on the brink of death. In a final act of cruelty, the retreating SS poisoned the food supplies, leading to the deaths of hundreds of prisoners who ate the tainted rations in their desperation. 2 days later, on May 5, 1945, soldiers of the 11th Armored Division of the U.S. Third Army arrived at the gates of Mauthausen. Staff Sergeant Albert J. Koziek of the 41st Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron recalled the moment. The stench of death was overpowering. Bodies were stacked like cordwood in front of the crematorium. It was a sight I will never forget. Lieutenant Colonel Taylor, one of the first American officers to enter the camp, would later write in his report, "I've been in the army for 30 years, and I've seen many terrible things, but nothing could have prepared me for what I saw at Mauthausen." The liberators were met with scenes of unimaginable horror. Over 60,000 surviving prisoners, representing more than 25 nationalities, were found in various states of starvation and disease. Among them was Marcelino Bilbao, a Spanish Republican who had survived nearly 5 years in the camp. He later recounted, "When the Americans arrived, we thought we were dreaming. We couldn't believe it was real." Another survivor, Stanislaw Grzesiuk, a Polish prisoner who had been in the camp since 1940, wrote in his memoir, "For us, the Americans were like angels descending from heaven. But even angels couldn't erase what we had been through." In the aftermath of liberation, the true scale of the atrocities committed at Mauthausen-Gusen began to emerge. Conservative estimates suggest that at least 190,000 prisoners passed through the camp complex, with over 90,000 perishing within its walls. The site's grim history was punctuated by the death of Camp Commandant Franz Ziereis, who shot himself while attempting to flee on May 24, 1945. Before his death, Ziereis gave a deathbed confession, admitting to the murder of millions across the camp system, a statement that would be used in subsequent war crimes trials. Today, the Mauthausen-Gusen Memorial stands as a somber reminder of the darkest chapter in human history. The quarry, once a place of death and suffering, now echoes with the footsteps of visitors paying their respects. The stairs of death, worn smooth by the countless victims forced to climb them, serve as a haunting testament to the cruelty humans are capable of inflicting upon one another. At the base of the stairs, a plaque bears the words of concentration camp survivor and author Elie Wiesel, "For the dead and the living, we must bear witness." Echoes of despair, the Inferno of Auschwitz-Birkenau. In the quiet Polish town of Oswiecim, a name forever etched in infamy as Auschwitz, the darkest chapter of human history unfolded. On May 20th, 1940, the first transport of Polish political prisoners arrived at the gates of what would become the most notorious Nazi concentration and extermination camp. Little did these 728 men know that they were stepping into a world where the boundaries of human cruelty would be pushed beyond imagination. Among these first prisoners was Stanislaw Reiniak, who was given the prisoner number 31, a chilling reminder of how early in the camp's history he arrived. Reiniak would later recall, "We were the guinea pigs. They were just learning how to run a concentration camp on us." Auschwitz began as a single camp, originally designed to hold Polish political prisoners. However, under the ruthless command of SS Obersturmbannführer Rudolf Höss, it rapidly expanded into a vast complex of death and suffering. Höss, who would later write his memoirs while awaiting execution, coldly stated, "I commanded Auschwitz until the 1st of December 1943 and estimate that at least 2,500,000 victims were executed and exterminated there by gassing and burning." By 1942, Auschwitz II Birkenau had been established, its ominous train tracks leading directly to gas chambers capable of murdering thousands in a single day. The third main site, Auschwitz III Monowitz, became a hub of slave labor for the German industrial giant IG Farben. The expansion was so rapid that by 1944, Auschwitz had grown to include 45 subcamps spread across Upper Silesia and Moravia. As the complex grew, so did its capacity for inflicting misery. Prisoners were subjected to a life of unimaginable hardship from the moment they arrived. Dr. Miklos Nicely, a Hungarian Jewish prisoner forced to work under the infamous Dr. Josef Mengele, recalled the selection process. A wave of the hand to the right meant work, to the left the gas chamber, life or death. Dr. Mengele did the selecting with a flick of the finger, without a glance at the person standing before him. Mengele, known as the Angel of Death, conducted barbaric medical experiments on prisoners, particularly twins. One of his victims, Eva Moses Kor, who survived along with her twin sister Miriam, later said, "I was undressed. I was afraid they would assault me or kill me." Those deemed fit for work faced a grim existence of forced labor. In Auschwitz, first, prisoners toiled in workshops and factories, producing everything from uniforms to munitions for the Nazi war machine. At Birkenau, inmates were tasked with the gruesome job of disposing of bodies from the gas chambers, while others worked in the nearby agricultural farms. But perhaps the most notorious labor site was the Monowitz industrial complex. The Buna Werke factory at Monowitz, designed to produce synthetic rubber, was built using slave labor from the camp. By October 1942, over 25,000 inmates were working there, with thousands dying from the brutal conditions. At Monowitz, also known as Auschwitz III, prisoners worked in nightmarish conditions to produce synthetic rubber and fuel for IG Farben. Italian Jewish chemist Primo Levi, who survived Monowitz, wrote in his memoir, "If This Is a Man," "Our days followed a rhythm that had been calculated down to the second. Arbeit macht frei, work makes you free," said the inscription over the entrance to Auschwitz first. But here, work was a form of slow execution. Levi's prisoner number, 174517, tattooed on his arm, became a lifelong reminder of his ordeal. Another survivor, Elie Wiesel, who was sent to Monowitz at the age of 15, wrote in his book, Night, "Never shall I forget that night, the first night in camp, which has turned my life into one long night." The average life expectancy for a prisoner at Monowitz was just 3 months. Those who couldn't keep up with the brutal pace were sent to their deaths at Birkenau. Yet amidst this horror, small acts of resistance and humanity persisted. Levi recounted how a civilian Italian worker, Lorenzo Perrone, secretly shared his food rations, an act that Levi credited with saving his life. Levi wrote, "I believe that it was really due to Lorenzo that I am alive today, for his having constantly reminded me by his presence that there still existed a just world outside our own, something and someone still pure and whole." While Monowitz represented the extreme exploitation of slave labor, it was far from the only site of suffering within the Auschwitz complex. At Birkenau, the infamous Canada warehouses became a symbol of the Nazis' systematic plunder. Here, prisoners sorted through the possessions of those sent to the gas chambers. The warehouses were nicknamed Canada because Canada was seen as a land of plenty. Sarah Tuval Bernstein, a survivor who worked in Canada, later wrote, "We saw the treasured possessions of mothers for their babies. We knew these people had been murdered, and we were now touching their last connections to life." The scale of this operation was staggering. When Soviet troops liberated the camp, they found over 370,000 men's suits, 837,000 women's garments, and 44,000 pairs of shoes. The vast scale of human suffering at Auschwitz-Birkenau is almost incomprehensible. By the time of its liberation on January 27, 1945, an estimated 1.1 million people had been murdered within its barbed wire fences. The victims included approximately 960,000 Jews, 74,000 non-Jewish Poles, 21,000 Roma, 15,000 Soviet prisoners of war, and 15,000 others. Yet amidst this ocean of despair, there were islands of resistance and hope. On October 7, 1944, members of the Sonderkommando Jewish prisoners forced to work in the gas chambers and crematoria staged an uprising. Led by Zalman Gradowski, whose buried writings were later discovered, the rebels managed to destroy Crematorium 4 before being overwhelmed. Gradowski wrote before his death, "Dear finder, search everywhere, in every inch of soil. Dozens of documents are buried under it, mine and those of other persons, which will throw light on everything that was happening here." The uprising, though ultimately crushed, resulted in the death of 3 SS guards and the injury of 12 others. All 451 members of the Sonderkommando involved were executed. Another remarkable story of resistance is that of Witold Pilecki, a Polish cavalry officer who volunteered to be imprisoned in Auschwitz to gather intelligence. Pilecki spent nearly 3 years in the camp, organizing a resistance movement and smuggling out detailed reports on Nazi atrocities. His reports, known as Witold's Report, provided some of the first comprehensive accounts of the Holocaust to reach the Western Allies. Pilecki wrote, "I've been trying to live my life so that in the hour of my death I would rather feel joy than fear." Tragically, after surviving Auschwitz and fighting in the Warsaw Uprising, Pilecki was executed by the post-war communist government of Poland in 1948. As the Red Army approached in January 1945, the SS began evacuating Auschwitz, forcing nearly 60,000 prisoners on brutal death marches westward. Those too weak to march were left behind, and it was these survivors who greeted the Soviet soldiers when they finally reached the camp on January 27th. Among them was Primo Levi, who described the moment in The Truce. "They did not greet us, nor did they smile. They seemed oppressed not only by compassion, but by a confused restraint, which sealed their lips and bound their eyes to the funereal scene." The liberating soldiers found 7,650 sick or emaciated detainees in the camp, as well as hundreds of thousands of men's suits, more than 800,000 women's outfits, and more than 14,000 pounds of human hair. Today, Auschwitz-Birkenau stands as a museum and memorial, a stark reminder of the depths of human cruelty and the resilience of the human spirit. The rusted barbed wire, the crumbling chimneys of the crematoria, and the piles of victims' shoes all bear silent witness to the atrocities committed there. Yet they also serve as a powerful call to remembrance and vigilance. Over 2 million people visit the site annually, walking the same grounds where so many suffered and died. Echoes of the rocket's roar, the dark genesis of Mittelbau-Dora. In the heart of Nazi Germany, beneath the Harz Mountains, a sinister chapter of history unfolded. As Allied bombs rained down on German cities in 1943, the Nazi regime desperately sought a weapon to turn the tide of war. Their answer lay in the V-2 rocket, a technological marvel born from the minds of scientists, but forged by the hands of slaves. This is the story of Mittelbau-Dora, a subterranean hell where human suffering and scientific achievement collided in the twilight of the Third Reich. As Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, later wrote in his memoirs, the V-2 streak across the sky and the second gulp of vengeance was swallowed by the enemy. On August 28, 1943, the first prisoners arrived at what would become Mittelbau-Dora. These 107 inmates from Buchenwald concentration camp were tasked with an unholy mission to carve out a vast underground complex where the Nazis' vengeance weapon, the V-2 rocket, would be built away from Allied bombs. The site, initially a sub-camp of Buchenwald, was chosen for its proximity to an existing tunnel system in the Kohnstein mountain, near the town of Nordhausen in central Germany. The project was codenamed Mittelbau, Central Construction, and the camp would later be known as Dora, after the tunnel entrance closest to the prisoner barracks. As the prisoners began their grim work, the mountain echoed with the sound of pickaxes and explosions. The Nazi vision was ambitious, a network of tunnels stretching over 12 miles, with 2 main tunnels, each measuring a kilometer in length. These cavernous spaces would house the assembly lines for the V-2, as well as other advanced weapons like the V-1 flying bomb. The construction was overseen by SS Brigade Führer Hans Kammler, a ruthless engineer who had previously supervised the building of extermination camps. Kammler's motto was chillingly simple: "Don't worry about the victims, the work must proceed at all costs." The conditions in these tunnels defied description. Wernher von Braun, the brilliant rocket scientist who would later become a key figure in the American space program, visited the site in late 1943. Even he, a beneficiary of this slave labor, was shocked. "It was hell," he later recalled. "My spontaneous reaction was to talk to one of the SS guards, only to be told with unmistakable harshness that I should mind my own business." Von Braun's complicity in the use of slave labor would haunt him for years to come, leading him to later state, "I have very deep and sincere regrets for the victims of the V-2 rockets, but there were victims on both sides. The missile program was an essential activity of the war." For the prisoners, every day was a battle for survival. They worked 12-hour shifts in the dank, poorly ventilated tunnels, breathing air thick with rock dust that clogged their lungs. Malnutrition, exhaustion, and disease were constant companions. One survivor, Jean-Michel, described the nightmare. "We slept in the tunnels where we worked. We were stripped of our names, becoming mere numbers. I was 44,904 inches. Another survivor, Adam Kabbalah, recalled the constant presence of death. "Every morning, as we marched to work, we passed a cart piled high with the bodies of those who had died during the night." By early 1944, the camp had grown to hold over 12,000 prisoners from across occupied Europe. As production ramped up, so did the death toll. In the first 6 months of the camp's existence, over 2,900 inmates perished. Many succumbed to the brutal conditions, while others were executed for perceived sabotage or inability to work. The dead were cremated in Buchenwald until April 1944, when Mittelbau-Dora established its own crematorium to handle the growing number of corpses. The camp doctor, Heinrich Plaser, was known for his cruelty. He would often declare prisoners fit for work even when they were on the brink of death, stating coldly, "Here, one works until one falls down dead." Despite the horrific conditions, the V-2 production line became operational. On September 7, 1944, the first combat-ready V-2 rolled out of the tunnels. It was a technological marvel, the world's first long-range ballistic missile. Standing 46 feet tall and weighing 12.5 tons, it could deliver a 1-ton warhead to targets over 200 miles away. The rocket's speed, over 3,500 miles per hour at its maximum, made it practically impossible to intercept. Arthur C. Clarke, the renowned science fiction author who worked on radar countermeasures against the V-2 during the war, later wrote, "The V-2 rocket was the first man-made object to reach the fringes of space. It was the ancestor and forerunner of all the space vehicles flying today." As V-2S began raining down on London and Antwerp, the Allied advance continued. The first V-2 attack on London occurred on September 8, 1944, killing 3 people in the Chiswick area. By the end of the war, over 3,000 V-2S had been launched against Allied targets, causing an estimated 9,000 civilian deaths. Winston Churchill grimly noted, "The rocket achieved nothing except to impact on the morale of our people, already at its lowest ebb." In response to the approaching Allied forces, the SS began evacuating Mittelbau-Dora in early April 1945. Thousands of prisoners were forced on death marches or crammed into railcars. Many did not survive the journey. One such tragic transport was the Lost Transport, a train carrying over 2,000 prisoners that wandered for 3 weeks across Germany before finally being liberated by American troops near Tröbitz on April 23, 1945. Only about 430 of the original prisoners survived. On April 11, 1945, American troops of the 3rd Armored Division and the 104th Infantry Divisions reached the camp, liberating around 5,000 sick and dying prisoners who had been left behind. Corporal James Barrow of the 104th Division recalled the horrific scene. "We weren't prepared for what we found. The stench of death was overwhelming. The survivors looked more like skeletons than human beings." The legacy of Mittelbau-Dora is complex and haunting. Over its 18 months of operation, an estimated 60,000 prisoners passed through the camp. Of these, at least 20,000 perished, their lives sacrificed on the altar of technological progress. Yet from this crucible of suffering emerged advancements that would shape the future of rocketry and space exploration. Yves Béant, a French resistance fighter who survived Dora, poignantly observed, "The V-2 rocket, which cost thousands of deportees their lives, became the blueprint for the rockets that later took man to the moon. The question is, was the price too high?" After the war, many of the German scientists who had overseen V-2 production were recruited by the United States and the Soviet Union. Operation Paperclip brought Wernher von Braun and his team to America, where their expertise would contribute significantly to the US space program. The Saturn V rocket, that eventually took humans to the moon, owed much of its design to the work done at Mittelbau-Dora. This led to the sardonic observation by satirist Tom Lehrer, "Once the rockets are up, who cares where they come down? That's not my department," says Wernher von Braun. This dark inheritance sparked heated debate in the scientific community. As German rocket engineer Konrad Dannenberg, who worked on both the V-2 and later NASA projects, reflected, "We were interested in science, but you cannot see everything that happens around you. Germany is the prime example that technology enables you to do great things, but you have to watch who uses the technology. The ethical implications of using knowledge gained through such horrific means continue to be debated today." Today, Mittelbau-Dora stands as a memorial site, its remaining tunnels a stark reminder of the human cost of technological advancement unchecked by moral considerations. The camp's history forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the relationship between scientific progress and human rights, and the responsibility of scientists in times of war. As visitors walk through the preserved tunnels, they can see the remnants of the rocket production facilities and the primitive living quarters of the prisoners. One particularly moving exhibit is the Room of Names, where the identities of over 9,000 victims are displayed, restoring individuality to those who were reduced to numbers. The Crucible of Cruelty, Dachau's dark legacy unveiled. In the shadow of Munich, a mere 10 miles northwest of Bavaria's capital, lies a place where the darkest chapter of human history began to unfold. Dachau, a name that would become synonymous with horror, opened its gates on March 22, 1933, just weeks after Adolf Hitler's rise to power. As the first of the Nazi concentration camps, Dachau served as the prototype for the vast network of imprisonment and extermination that would soon engulf Europe. The town of Dachau, once known for its artists' colony and picturesque landscapes, would forever be tainted by the atrocities committed within the camp's walls. As German philosopher Theodor Adorno later remarked, to write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric. The same could be said of Dachau, where the very concept of humanity was challenged. The camp was established in an abandoned munitions factory, its transformation overseen by Heinrich Himmler, then Munich's police president. On that fateful March day, the first 200 prisoners, mainly communists and social democrats, were marched through the town to the camp. Local photographer Heinrich Hoffmann, Hitler's personal photographer, captured the moment, a chilling preview of the horrors to come. As the first prisoners arrived, mostly political opponents of the Nazi regime, they were greeted by a chilling sight: the wrought iron gate bearing the words "Arbeit macht frei," work sets you free. This cruel irony would be replicated at other camps, a mockery of hope for those who passed beneath it. The gate, designed by camp inmate Karl Roeder, became an enduring symbol of Nazi deception and cruelty. Theodor Eicke, appointed as the camp commandant in June 1933, implemented a brutal system of rules and punishments that would become the model for all other Nazi camps. Known as the father of the concentration camp system, Eicke's regime was characterized by extreme violence and arbitrary punishments. His infamous Dachau school trained SS guards in methods of dehumanization and terror. One of his trainees, Rudolf Hoss, who later became the commandant of Auschwitz, wrote in his memoirs, "Eicke drummed it into us again and again that leniency and softness were weakness, and weakness had to be rooted out." One prisoner, Hans Beimler, who managed to escape in 1933, described the horrors in his book, In the Murderer's Camp. Dachau is the bitter picture of fascism in its naked form, a picture of unparalleled horror. As the years passed, Dachau's prisoner population swelled and diversified. Political prisoners were joined by Jews, Roma and Sinti, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses and clergy who opposed the Nazi regime. By 1937, the camp was expanded to accommodate 6,000 prisoners. However, by the end of the war, over 30,000 inmates were crammed into a space designed for a fraction of that number. Among the notable prisoners was Martin Niemöller, the Protestant pastor famous for his poem, First They Came. Niemöller spent the last 7 years of Nazi rule in Dachau, later reflecting, "It took me a long time to learn that God is not the enemy of my enemies. He is not even the enemy of his enemies." Forced labor became a cornerstone of life in Dachau. Prisoners were compelled to work in various industries, their labor exploited to support the Nazi war machine. The Deutsche Ausrüstungswerke, German equipment works, established workshops within the camp, where inmates produced everything from clothing and shoes for the German military to rifles and aircraft parts. The infamous Messerschmitt aircraft factory, located near Dachau, utilized prisoner labor extensively. Survivors recall working 12-hour shifts, assembling fighter planes under the constant threat of beatings and execution. One of the most notorious labor operations was the herb plantation, where prisoners were forced to cultivate medicinal plants in often brutal conditions. This project, initiated by Himmler's personal interest in homeopathy, saw inmates working long hours in the fields, exposed to the elements and subject to harsh punishment for failing to meet quotas. The plantation, known as plantage, covered over 200 acres and grew over 200 different types of herbs. SS Dr. Sigmund Rascher, infamous for his cruel human experiments, used herbs from this plantation in his research. The camp also housed a porcelain factory, where skilled artisans among the prisoners were forced to produce fine ceramics for the SS. In a bitter twist of fate, some of these items, bearing the mark KL Dachau, Konzentrationslager Dachau, would later become sought-after collector's items, a macabre reminder of the camp's dark history. The factory, operated by Alec Porcelain, produced figurines, plates, and other decorative items, many featuring Nazi symbols and imagery. As the war progressed, Dachau's role in arms production intensified. Satellite camps were established nearby, including the infamous Allach subcamp, where prisoners labored in BMW's aircraft engine factory. The conditions in these subcamps were often even worse than in the main camp, with higher mortality rates due to the combination of hard labor, malnutrition, and disease. At the Kaufering complex of subcamps, prisoners were forced to construct massive underground factories for fighter jet production, a project codenamed Ringeltaub, wood pigeon. One prisoner, Edgar Kupfer-Kobowitz, secretly documented his experiences in a diary, writing, "I am a number, 24814. I have no name. I am a number. From 5:30 in the morning until 9 o'clock at night, I am number 24814. In between, I am asleep, and dreams bring back my name." Kupfer-Kobowitz managed to hide over 1,800 pages of his diary, which he later published, providing one of the most comprehensive first-hand accounts of life in Dachau. As Allied forces approached in April 1945, the camp descended into chaos. On April 26th, over 7,000 prisoners were forced on a death march southward. Many died from exhaustion, hunger, or were shot by SS guards. One survivor, Max Mannheimer, recalled, "We marched for days without food or water. Those who couldn't keep up were shot on the spot." On April 29th, American troops of the 42nd and 45th Infantry Divisions arrived at Dachau, confronting scenes of unimaginable horror. Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks, who led the 157th Infantry Regiment, later wrote, "The scene was almost beyond description. The stench of death was overpowering." The liberation of Dachau marked not the end, but the beginning of a new chapter in the camp's history. From November 1945 to August 1948, the US Army used the former concentration camp to hold SS officers and Nazi officials awaiting trial. The Dachau trials, a series of proceedings held within the camp itself, saw 1,672 defendants tried for war crimes and crimes against humanity. These trials were held in the camp's maintenance building, a grim setting that served as a reminder of the atrocities committed there. These trials were notable for their use of common design theory, which allowed for the prosecution of individuals for their participation in a criminal organization, even if specific criminal acts could not be proven. This legal approach would influence later international criminal law. Joshua Green, in his book Justice at Dachau, noted, "The Dachau trials set a precedent for holding individuals accountable for crimes against humanity, paving the way for future international tribunals." Among those tried was Dr. Klaus Schilling, who had conducted malaria experiments on prisoners. When questioned about the ethics of his research, Schilling coldly replied, "I have always worked for humanity in my scientific research." He was sentenced to death and hanged in May 1946. Schilling's experiments, which involved infecting over 1,000 prisoners with malaria, resulted in hundreds of deaths. His defense that his work was for the greater good of humanity was rejected by the court. Martin Gottfried Weiss, who served as the commandant of Dachau from 1942 to 1943, was also among those tried. During his trial, Weiss attempted to distance himself from the atrocities, claiming he had no knowledge of the medical experiments. However, survivors' testimonies painted a different picture. One former prisoner, Dr. Franz Blaha, testified, "I saw Weiss watching the experiments personally." Weiss was found guilty and executed in May 1946. Blaha, a Czech physician forced to perform autopsies on victims of Nazi experiments, provided crucial testimony in several Dachau trials. The trials also brought to light the stories of resistance and humanity that had persisted even in the darkest corners of the camp. Johann Lenz, an SS guard who had secretly aided prisoners, was acquitted after multiple inmates testified on his behalf. One such testimony came from a Czech prisoner who stated, "Lenz was different. He treated us like human beings." Lenz had smuggled food and medicine to prisoners and warned them of impending selections for execution or transfer. Today, Dachau stands as a memorial site, a stark reminder of the depths of human cruelty and the resilience of the human spirit. Visitors walk the same grounds where thousands suffered and died, their footsteps echoing in the silence of history. The preserved buildings, the reconstructed barracks, and the somber museums serve not just as a monument to the past, but as a warning for the future. The International Monument, designed by Nandor Glid and inaugurated in 1968, features emaciated figures entangled in barbed wire, a powerful representation of the suffering endured by Dachau's prisoners. As we delve into the depths of human cruelty, we've barely scratched the surface of the Nazi forced labor camp system. From the frozen quarries of Mauthausen to the underground tunnels of Mittelbau-Dora, each camp tells a story of unimaginable suffering and resilience. We could speak of Flossenburg, where prisoners labored in granite quarries, their lives as fragile as the stones they split, or of Ravensbrück, the largest women's concentration camp, where inmates were forced to produce textiles for the German war machine. We end with the wise words of Holocaust survivor Viktor Frankl. "Everything can be taken from a man, but one thing, the last of human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. May we choose compassion and understanding in the face of adversity." Until next time, this is the Diary of Julius Caesar, signing off from the shadows of history.